do not have the screen operating to my right or the screen operating behind me. So we are relying entirely on that screen over there, and of course my clerk has a screen here. So if anybody wants to make at any stage ask a question as to timing or anything else, I will certainly entertain that. So I think, without further ado, as the mover of the motion is here, can I ask Rosie Duffield to move the motion?
Thank you so much, Dame Cheryl, and it's such a pleasure to serve under your chairship in my first ever Westminster Hall debate. I beg to move that this House considers the Government's response to the UN report on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I rise to speak today on an issue of great national importance and indeed of national embarrassment. What I'm raising today is something which is in dire need of urgent and effective remedy. I refer to the United Nations assessment on the UK government's ability, or inability, I should say, to protect the rights of our disabled citizens. As I'm sure most people in this room are aware, last August, the UN report on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities found that the UK was in serious breach of international human rights law. They found that the UK was lacking in enforcing or upholding equality legislation in sectors including education, justice, employment and others. Although the beginning of the report offered some praise to recent Scottish and Welsh legislation, there were 80 recommendations for further action for the UK government and the devolved parliaments to implement. Unfortunately, as important as I believe it is to do so, I'll not have enough time today to consider all 80 recommendations provided by the UN in my opening speech. I am hoping that other colleagues here today will afford focus to some areas that I will sadly have to omit. I will focus on the aspects of disability rights and equality rights which are the most repeatedly brought to my attention by my disabled constituents and by disability rights groups across the country. And those are poverty, inequality in employment and substandard, illogical and poorly enacted access to welfare provision. As such, I shall focus on Articles 27 and 28 and draw some focus to Articles 7, 13 and 21. Let me begin by painting a picture of the current situation in the UK. Right now, there are around 4.2 million disabled people living in poverty across the country. In fact, over half of all those living in poverty are either disabled or living with someone who is. In the UK, half of all disabled people are still unemployed, and even when they do attain employment, not enough provisions are in place for them to maintain this sustainably in the long term. Article 27 of the Convention's report made 4 key recommendations in this area which have yet to be implemented. This government has not yet offered an effective employment policy for disabled people. I ask the Minister... Absolutely.
I congratulate her on securing this, her first debate, on what an important subject it is. Specifically on employment, could I invite her to come to or even join my all-party group for youth employment that looked at this very subject, those furthest from the labour market, and in particular the report that drew on organisations such as Leonard Cheshire, who highlight a really important body of work in this particular area.
Absolutely. Thank you for raising that. Thank you. I shall do, actually. That would be really interesting. Right. Okay, where was I? Sorry. I'd move that access to legal aid and information on accessing such is made much more readily available so that disabled people can challenge employers and potential employers on inadequate access arrangements. According to Article 13 of the UN report regarding rights to justice, the UK must provide free or affordable legal aid for disabled people in all areas of the law. I ask the Government what considerations of the legal aid system have been made to facilitate and enfranchise the legal challenges of disabled people on any of the articles and recommendations laid down by the UN report. In order to access good legal representation and advice, disabled people also need quality digital information services that take account of customers' disabilities in their design. The UN Committee in Article 21 recommended that the UK improve legal accessibility standards for all digital information services, including those offered by Her Majesty's Government.
Would my honourable friend give way?
Absolutely.
On that point, Would my honourable friend, thank you, would my honourable friend agree with me that part of this commitment is access to information? And when we've got, since 2010, 478 libraries closing, losing 8,000 librarians, that actually this access to information is being yet again another blockage for disabled people going into work and getting their human rights.
Absolutely, and I have heard from my own constituents that it is just assumed that they have access to a computer, whereas many people do use public libraries for that service. On top of all of this, and as if existing barriers to disabled people maintaining sustainable income and accessing information and help weren't already high enough, the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities concluded that UK government cuts have disproportionately impacted disabled people and amounted to, I quote, grave or systematic violations of the rights of persons with disabilities, end quote. Absolutely.
Just going back to the point that she made about helping disabled people get into work, because actually my experience in my constituency in Chelmsford is that there's a huge number of projects that are going on that are actually helping disabled people into work. And clearly every individual is different and some people need different levels of support. But won't you join me in saying actually well done to the 600,000 disabled people who have moved into work in the past 4 years? There is great progress being made and we should congratulate them.
That sounds really fantastic.
We do like interventions to be shorter, slightly shorter than that. Thank you. Rosie Duff.
That sounds really good news, but in my own constituency, for example, the lack of job centres that have recently closed really severely impacts on that sort of access that I'm talking about. So it would be great if that didn't happen. In fact, the Centre for Welfare Reform found that austerity has been targeted at disabled people 9 times more than the general population, and severely disabled people have been targeted 19 times more than the general population. Those statistics are shocking. It's clear that the targeted austerity measures that the government have put into place are unusually cruel in this regard. Article 28 of the UN recommendations says that UK law should ensure that welfare policies protect the income levels of disabled people and their families. There's a key word there, protect. I want to know what this government thinks it's doing in order to protect those income levels and protect disabled people from having to beg for help from friends, family and food banks in order to stave off poverty, dire need and hunger. This government must also ensure that local authorities have enough funds to support disabled people. Also in Article 28, the UN report is critical of how the squeezing of local authority funding is impacting disabled people. I only need to think of the shocking situation of some social housing provision for people in my constituency. For example, one woman who's a full-time wheelchair user, who I'll call Janet, came to my office for help. Janet had been confined to her council flat for months and months. She'd been housed on a high floor of a housing block. It was an unadapted flat, and it was not good enough. My office were pleased to help secure her a move when she needed our help. But for every Janet out there that we know about, there are 10 other people who are forced to make do with inadequate social housing in private. It's also important to remember that these inequalities experienced by disabled people in our community are intersectional. The UN has expressed concern about a lack of legislation in UK law preventing intersectional discrimination. Intersectional disadvantages mean that a person can experience multiple disadvantages for different discriminations at the same time. So whilst it's horrifying that according to the Disabled Living Foundation, the average income of families with disabled children is £15,270, so that's 23.5% below the UK mean income, which is £19,968, we can imagine that for a single mother who faces other difficulties, such as the gender pay gap and limited child welfare due to cuts, these hardships will be so much worse. Article 7 of the UN Committee's report called on the UK government to cut the high levels of poverty amongst families with disabled children. I'd ask the Minister to tell me what monitoring has been done with respect to this, and if she feels that recent statistics relating to family poverty, when one or more of the children are disabled, are something the government should be proud of. Of course, it isn't just families that are affected. The onslaught of cuts and austerity measures, unscrupulously enforced by the Conservative government, have left many single disabled adults and couples where one or more of the couple are disabled, struggling to attain and access the bare necessities of life. One well-known topic adversely affecting disabled people throughout the UK is the flawed rollout and poor implementation of the Personal Independence Payments, or PIP scheme. The many statistics and stories we regularly hear are simply gut-wrenching. As a result of PIP assessments, 80% of disabled people have seen their health deteriorate due to stress or anxiety, and a third of those who experience funding cuts due to the outcomes of the test have struggled to pay for food, rent and basic utilities. Yes.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way, and I congratulate her on bringing this debate for the Chamber. She was talking about cuts, but would you also welcome the actual increase the government has provided for the Access to Work Fund, which gone from 42,000 to 57,200, so people with disabilities can access that fund to get themselves into work. And I would also ask her, as I led a debate in this Chamber previously, to sign up to the Disability Confidence Scheme, as I'm sure she probably has, as other members in this House have.
In that point, I still understand that the cap is quite low and it's quite difficult for people to get beyond that. It sounds too simple that PIP assessments and the PIP problems cause poverty, but it's true, and those statistics bear witness to this fact. The trauma caused by the PIP assessment process and the ramifications of losing welfare provision becomes even more infuriating when we know that 69% of decisions made by PIP assessment bodies are then overturned by our courts. I hear about this all the time from my constituents every single week. If 69% of decisions are challenged and later found out to be wrong, then the original system isn't just broken, it's wholly inadequate.
Lady for giving way. And I do agree that for some people this PIP assessment has been severely challenging, but actually only 4% of cases are now being appealed because the process has improved. And does she agree with me that continual improvement is needed, and actually we should be working to have these PIP assessments recorded where the claimant wishes, so that the claimant can have greater confidence in the process?
Okay, I thank my honourable friend for her point, but as my colleagues are saying, I think it is often the case that people give up on the process because it is simply too distressing and stressful, and certainly I haven't heard any sort of success cases coming to my surgery. People are really, really distressed by this.
Will she give way?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. In Liverpool, it's the case that when a constituent tries to appeal one of these rulings by an assessment centre, there is a 9-month wait at Liverpool Tribunal Services. And the case that I raised with the Prime Minister of my constituent, Anthony, has been resolved on a one-by-one basis. But this is affecting thousands and thousands of our constituents.
To that point, I have heard similar weight levels as well, which is just really distressing and adds to all of the trauma that's been going on. I'll give you an example. Julius Holgate, who's a double leg amputee, won an appeal. The Department for Work and Pensions told him that he was fit to work because he could, quote, climb stairs with his arms. Because he lost his benefits, Julius resorted to selling his belongings in order to survive. The DWP claims that this was a clerical error, but in reality, this was an error caused by a lack of humanity. Article 28 of the UN recommendations also calls on the UK government to ensure that all eligibility criteria and assessments for PIP, ESA and universal credit are in line with the social model of disability. When is this being done? It's worth noting that despite these repeated, serious and notorious assessment failures by Atos and Capita, the outsourced companies who conduct these assessments, this government has renewed their contracts to run the assessment process by 2 more years. 2 more years. These organisations have repeatedly failed to meet their 97% target of acceptable test, and 100,000 people have won appeals against their assessments. How much is this flawed system costing the government? If we're to ignore the human element just for a second and question how much each reassessment and court challenge is costing, surely we can agree that this money would be better spent on rolling out decent provisions for the disabled and on remedying those affronts to human rights by introducing a holistic, bespoke assessment service that includes a home visit. So the PIP assessment system is highly traumatic, often misassessed, and in January of this year, the PIP assessment system was ruled on by our own courts as being severely in need of remedy and review. In January this year, the High Court ruled that the PIP system is blatantly discriminatory against people with mental health conditions, for example. This is a criticism echoed by many mental health and disability organisations. I'm sure we can all appreciate that all wounds and maladies are not necessarily physical or or observable. A single-day assessment, therefore, is a ludicrous way of properly gauging whether a person is in need of financial assistance due to mental health conditions. It's high time that this government turned their focus away from tax breaks for bankers and towards a system of disability welfare, which is at the very least in line with basic human rights as outlined by the UN. The Convention needs to become part of UK law. The UN Committee noted last year that there had not been a full review of the UK's law and policies in light of this Convention. There's not enough information on what the UK is doing to stop disabled people being negatively affected as the UK leaves the EU. A statement by Inclusion London explains that disabled people's organisations are seriously disappointed by the government's response and its failure to adequately take on board any of the UN inquiry recommendations. This response brings into question the government's commitment to the progressive realisation of the disabled people's rights. Yes.
I'm very grateful. Being very generous with her time. But she's used phrases such as targeted austerity. She's used phrases such as lack of humanity. Will she not join me in welcoming the fact that, in fact, disability benefit spending is at its highest level ever, and that it's continuing to be higher for every year up to 2022 than it was in 2010? Will she not just welcome that fact?
Okay. I think we all know that in real terms that isn't really the case because the cost of living is constantly rising, and I certainly don't hear from my struggling constituents who are struggling to pay bills that their lives are any more easier. In fact, the opposite. So we'd have to disagree on that one. So since the committee's investigation in October 2015 was carried out, further measures have been introduced which have or will have further adverse impacts on disabled people. This includes the cut to Employment and Support Allowance, ESA, for those in the work-related activity group due to come into force in April 2017, and further cuts to local authority social care budgets. So I call on the government to develop and implement a plan of action that abolishes any laws, regulations, customs and practice that discriminate against disabled people. Imagine losing your livelihood due to a flawed assessment which is not your fault. Imagine going hungry, living in poverty and being under so much stress that it severely affects your well-being. Most of us in this room today won't ever have to experience that, but most of us aren't already also living with the challenges of disability. I call on this government to begin taking the poverty and discrimination experiences of disabled people and those with cared-for loved ones with disability seriously. And I call on this government to, as a bare minimum, honour its commitment to human rights by accepting and acting on the recommendations provided by the UN inquiry. The protection of human rights is a sacred function of the state, and we are currently in breach of this function. It's not the time to deny facts, it's not the time to ignore inequality, and it's not the time to dismiss the well-documented experiences of our citizens. It's time to act. So I urge the Minister to do just that. Thank you for listening to me today. I'm sure many of my colleagues wish to speak, and as I said at the beginning, there are so many recommendations that we could cover in this debate. Each recommendation and article is important and each deserving of its own debate. Thank you very much.
The question is that this House has considered the government's response to the UN report on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Mr. John Howell.
It's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Let me also congratulate the honourable member for bringing an important debate. She mentioned during her speech of the problems that are created by the closure of job centres. There are also other cases that are similar to that. For example, my own constituency has no job centre in it at all. The job centres are in the neighbouring constituencies of Oxford, Abingdon, or indeed in Reading. But rather than moan about that and to point out the difficulties that creates, I've been working with the Secretary of State to try to put in place a solution that overcomes that. And that solution is to have a system of mobile job centres. And those mobile job centres, the model for that is already there in the way that the post office runs its mobile post offices around the country. And you can envisage the situation where in areas either where a job centre is closed or where there is no job centre, that job centre vans turn up on certain days. They would have to be on regular days in order to provide the services and to provide the advice that many people want when they go to them. And I do think that that is a model that I'm quite happy to recommend to this chamber. But it is, as I say, a model that I'm already working on with the Secretary of State in order to try and to get that ready. The second point that I would make is in relation to a number of PIP cases. And in those, there have been a number of cases where, quite openly I say this, that the speed with which that PIPs have been delivered has been appallingly slow. And again, I have been working with the Secretary of State to look at how those can be speeded up and how that information can be better integrated into how PIP is delivered, so that we improve the system, that we don't continually knock it, but we try our best to make it work better and to improve it. Now, the motivation for speaking today was to highlight the excellent work that is being done in my own constituency by the Ways and Means Trust. And it is doing this by way of what is called a Green Shoots Nursery, which provides a range of excellent help for those with a whole range of disabilities, including with mental disabilities, in how to do work. It provides lectures in those areas in order to try to provide them with the basic intellectual grasp of what they need to do, and it provides them with the physical work experience to be able to take this forward. And I look forward to Christmas, as I'm sure everyone does, for a range of different reasons. But I look forward to Christmas for going to Green Shoots to get the wreath for my front door, because they make them in a particularly spectacular way. Of course.
I thank you for your contribution to this very important debate. Would my honourable friend agree with me that we've moved on since this report was made, and the report referred to was refuted by the government at the time? But through the Disability Confidence Scheme, would you agree with me it's good that 600,000 disabled people have secured employment and the dignity of employment? And that must surely be a good thing in this system. And that's happened in the last 4 years.
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. He is, of course, quite right. This is a very important thing to mention, and I will come on to say something a bit about the Disability Confidence Scheme in a moment. But let me just finish what I was saying on the Green Shoots Nursery, because I think that is important. And I think that he has already highlighted, my honourable friend has already highlighted the importance of dignity in employment. And I do think that that is important for people who might otherwise be disadvantaged from taking employment. And from what I have seen of the way that these charities work, it has delivered a tremendous boost in the confidence of those people, in their well-being, and in their ability to help to provide for themselves. Of course I will.
Prior to coming to this place, I was the main development worker for Social Firms England, which supported charities, enterprising charities like the one he describes in his constituency, to support disabled people into work. But that Social Firms England was decimated by cuts. Social Firms Scotland and Wales were active and well supported, but Social Firms England, I was the only worker, 1 day a week, that was it, that was all the support they had. Social firms are going to the wall. That's what's happening. That's what's happening to disability support. And Remploy was also cut. So the support getting disabled people into work actually been decimated in the last 8 years, not moved forward.
Well said. Being very, very generous, but I'm not going to remind you all again. Mr. Howell.
Thank you, Dame Carroll. I do not accept what the honourable gentleman has said. I do not accept that there are these level of cuts that are applying to the charities in my own constituency, or that they are having as appalling an effect on those with disabilities who are continuing their work. And what this charity shows is that we actually have a large range of companies and organisations that are involved in providing these services. There are the likes of Microsoft and Glaxo, for example, that are providing these services. And we also have slightly smaller companies that are household names, like Sainsbury's, who are also providing it. But there are also a range of individual organisations, like the Green Shoots Nursery, like Leonard Cheshire, yes. And indeed like Mencap, who are also providing this sort of assistance to people with disabilities in my own constituency. And to pick up on my honourable friend's point, the Disability Confidence Scheme now has over 6,500 employers that are involved in it. And I do think that that is something to be celebrated. And I'm pleased to say that all main government departments have now achieved disability confident leader status, and that is something that is to be welcomed.
Will my honourable friend give way?
Of course.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and he's making a very good point about the number of disabled people in work. I think, in this debate, I think it's really important that we do actually tell the facts for constituents, because I think on one side of this House we've got very emotive language being used, and I know through having a family member who's been disabled and the amount of cases that my office and my team work through, how disruptive some of the PIP assessments can be. And I think we just need to cut through and actually get to the facts and look at turning the screws on Atos and the companies that are delivering these services, because it's not a genuine intention of government to be inhumane, but it is a failure of some of the administration of these companies who are employed to do so. I'm sorry, Chair.
I'm sorry, Dame Cheryl, if I allow these interventions to run on, but I think my honourable friend makes a very important point, and he is absolutely right that we need to cut through the haze that there is about this to give the figures. So let me repeat the figures again of 600,000 disabled people that have been moved back into work over the last 4 years, and I think that that is something that we should be proud of and should hang on to. And with regard to the PIP assessments, like him, the problems that I have found have been about the implementation of PIP. Not about PIP itself, but about the implementation of PIP. And that is where I think it behoves us to work very closely with the department and with the Secretary of State to make sure that we get those things right. And I'm very pleased that I've been able to do this. Of course.
Thank you. On the
Provided it's short.
On the PIP assessment process, this time last year I was getting a lot of cases from constituents who had problems with the PIP assessment process, but it does appear to have improved. And I fundamentally believe that it would be better if it was easier to get these assessments recorded, so that would put more trust in the system. Does he agree?
I do agree with my honourable friend. I think she has got this right, and I think that is something that we can all help with. I'm not going to claim responsibility for the improvement in PIP, but I think that all of us who have been working with the department and working with the Secretary of State to do that can claim some responsibility for the improvement in the process, and we need to do more in order to make that to make that work. So with those remarks, Dame Charon, before anyone else wants to intervene at length, I will sit down and allow the debate to move on.
Lasagna.
Thank you very much, Dame Cheryl. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. May I just state for the record, I apologise in advance as I have some parliamentary business to attend to, so I may not be able to stay for the wind-up of the debate. I would really like to pay honour and tribute to my honourable friend for bringing such a very important debate, and the points that have been made thus far have been both interesting but troubling at the same time. The reason why I say that is because from speaking from experience of my constituency, whilst I understand the facts that are being presented and the figures, the reality is very different. When I speak to members of or constituents of mine, I'm just going to share some of the stories that they've shared with me, with yourselves. So I won't say their surnames, but I will give their first names. I was approached by a constituent called Hugh. He has T-cell paralysis in hands and feet. He struggles with dressing himself without great discomfort. And when I met him, he couldn't lift a cup of coffee with both hands, and walking could be difficult. He was found to be fit for work. Then I have Gloria. She's 71 years old with arthritis in her legs. She lives on the second floor in a building with no lift and struggles with stairs. She lives with a grown-up son who has learning difficulties, although he has a job. But she was told she cannot be moved to any higher bands with regards to her housing, as her son works and they consider him to live independently. Then I have Victoria. She has severe mobility issues. She has sepsis in her legs. The first assessment she had, the disability element was reduced, as she could prepare her own meals and wash herself with installations at home. So her condition has since got worse, but she was, however, refused PIP, and she was refused the PIP assessment at home. She was only granted an assessment when my office intervened. And lastly, I have Harry. He was working in the Navy. He sustained a brain injury, and so he's not able to work, suffers from severe depression, anxiety, as well as having the brain injury. The PIP assessor said he was too aggressive in his assessment, ignorant of his mental health conditions, and PIP was declined as a result. They're just a few of the people that I come across. So the warm words or advising that there's more money that you can access is actually not helpful at all. And the last person, which actually I was quite tearful when I spoke with her, when she explained she'd had 4 strokes. 4. She was expected to do a work capability assessment. And because she touched her face in the assessment, they said that she was able to work, and actually they didn't believe she was as paralysed as had been said. Things like this are what we come across as members of Parliament. We are not just standing here to say it's unfair just because we want to be the opposition against what government has set out. But the fact remains that it is unfair. The disabled people that I represent in my constituency have said to me that they believe they are the forgotten class. Where are they when we're looking at these things, when we're looking at these assessments? When assessors get to ask questions, I agree with my honourable member that said, that they should be recorded, because actually the ways in which questions are put across is actually quite bad as well. For example, rather than saying, can you walk 50 metres? Do they know how far 50 metres are? We're not going to look at that. And another of my constituents who has Asperger's was told, you can walk 50 metres, can't you? So he said yes, not understanding actually what that would, the effect and the impact that would have. And I think the fact that Article 27, as my honourable friend from Canterbury has said, the 4 recommendations haven't been taken on board. What we need to do, talking about facts, how many of these recommendations have been implemented? How many of these people have to go under the radar, unnoticed, unhelped, fight, go for appeals with no deadline, no time frame, no timeline of how long they have to wait for their appeal to be heard, yet they're supposed to just get on with life? And it's not just about saying we're trying to encourage disabled people into work, because that is very, very applaudable, and that's very honourable, and I agree with that, when they can work. But there are many disabled people that can't work, and they are penalised for the fact that not only are they in sometimes a physical disability, which actually prohibits them from working. But now we're going to penalise you. We're going to say to you that we know you need financial assistance. We know you need this welfare, but we're not going to give it to you until you can prove to us how disabled you are. Something is wrong there. I'll give way here and then here.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way, and she's making a passionate speech, and she's making it very cogently and clearly. In terms of disabled people getting into work, will she accept that the vast majority do want to move into work? And whilst welcoming the 600,000 that already have done, will she agree with me that's just a start, and we should be looking to close the disability employment gap in its entirety?
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention. I thank you. Let me be clear. I agree with you that it is good that disabled people want to get into work. Absolutely. And I agree with you that this is the start. Where we disagree or where we differ is the fact that we have disabled people that are not able to work. And they are fighting to prove they are not able to work. That is what I don't agree with. This is not correct. This is what's against their human rights. I'm not saying those that can work shouldn't work. That is not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying those that cannot work, we should listen to what they're saying to us. They're going through assessment. I have a constituent that had 4 strokes. And she's physically disabled, yet because she touched her face, she's told she can work. There's something wrong there. Someone that's a double amputee being told they can climb the stairs with their hands, there's something wrong there, and that's what needs to be addressed.
Yes. Thank you.
I thank my honourable friend, and she is making an incredibly passionate speech, which I completely agree with. These assessments really need reviewing. My constituent had wanted a home visit. He struggled to even leave his house. On the first appointment, he fell outside his door, couldn't get to the appointment. The second appointment, which they agreed to give, he struggled to get the buses. The transport was slow, delayed. He got there 3 minutes late. They refused to see him. He didn't get his assessment. This urgently needs changing.
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention. I agree this needs changing completely. But what my concern is, if there are recommendations that could make a process better, or even make it more streamlined, why wouldn't those recommendations be adopted? Being 3 minutes late, I don't have the details of his situation. I don't understand why it would be refused, but I do agree that it needs to be revised. I think all of us are in agreement that we are seeking to help those that need assistance. But what we're questioning here today is why recommendations that would make that process easier and more streamlined are not being taken on board. Why are we not looking at their rights? We're all human. We're all one race, the human race. So why are we not looking at them and saying, actually, you need assistance? A bit like a body, if we, to coin a phrase from government, if it's a big society and something isn't functioning correctly, why don't we stop and rectify it? Why do we just say, actually, don't worry about that and carry on? That's how it comes across to our constituents. Yes, I'll give way there, and then I'll give way.
Thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. I'd just like to ask if she's ever taken part in a work capability assessment, because I did go and sit through one which was acted out for me, in order for me to be able to understand the process. It's enormously helpful, and I would really recommend to other members of this House to go through, you can either sit through one, or they will show you through the entire process of one. And it was a really, really helpful process to aid one's understanding.
Thank you, and I'll be short. Sorry, I realise time is short. I haven't been to a work capability assessment. What I did do is allow one of the people I work with, she was a barrister and she goes to many of them, in fact, to advocate on behalf of the disabled people that she goes on behalf of, because they're not very clear and the way they ask questions can be quite misleading, which is why I was able to give the analogy of the distance in metres. I think, yeah, I give way.
She's making a very good speech with a lot of very good points, but just Just to come back at the point she seemed to be making just now, I believe the government has been listening, and particularly the Minister on the front bench today, I know, is very much aware of some of the shortcomings in the assessment process and has worked incredibly hard to try and rectify those. So would you be willing to acknowledge that the government has been listening to the concerns of members right across the House and improvements are actually being made in the assessment process?
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. No, I won't agree. What I'll say is they're hearing, but they are absolutely not listening. If they were listening, they would implement the recommendations, and I end my speech on that point. Thank you.
Debbie Abrams.
It's an absolute pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I congratulate my honourable friend for her excellent speech? It really was excellent. I'm going to be very brief. I know we've got several speakers. But just to say, this is about the UN Convention on the Rights for Persons with Disabilities and the committee that investigated the UK on breaches around those rights. This started back in 2015, and I, at the time, was the Shadow Minister for Disabled People and was interviewed by the committee. And the very first report said that there were grave and systematic violations of the Convention. The findings, which were published in 2016, charged the UK government with failing to uphold the rights that we as a signatory from 2009 had agreed to comply with. This was based on facts. This was based on testimony. This was based on evidence. We've been talking about we should be judging things about the facts. This was based on this. And the government must accept responsibility around this. There's a devastating impact on the government's austerity policies. They have had a biggest impact on disabled people. In 8 years, we have seen cuts in social security support, which has already been mentioned and focused, but the convention goes much beyond that. We've also seen cuts to disabled people needing social care, cuts in specific support for disabled people in the NHS, cuts to SEND support in schools and disabled students' allowances. It goes on and on. We've been debating around trains. We've seen cuts in access to all to improve accessibility to train stations, cuts in supported housing, cuts to legal aid, and much, much more. It is absolutely horrendous what disabled people are going through. But I want to focus, if I can, just on a few points in relation to the UN's reports. The session that they had back in August 2017, which was meant to be around seeing if there had been any progress since a devastating report from 2016. And they said, absolutely, unfortunately, no, you haven't. You are not a global leader on disability rights. And we again have seen in the recent debate around the EU withdrawal bill a fundamental disagreement about upholding rights because the failure to support the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which gives more protections in domestic law to disabled people. It was, I'm sorry, I'm not going because my colleagues still want to speak. They said cuts to social protection in the UK were a human catastrophe. A catastrophe. And the UK's human rights watchdog stated that the examination by the UN had seen a disconnect, and this is what we are hearing from what has been said, that everything's hunky-dory on that side of the House, to what we are saying. There is a disconnect between the UK government's replies and the lived experiences of disabled people. In conclusion, the rapporteur stated that the committee was deeply concerned about the lack of recognition of the findings and the recommendations of the inquiry. The government has said they will not be acting on this report. And this is not the only one. We have the EU Council for Europe also stating that there are significant concerns around upholding the rights of disabled people. The Minister for Disabled People has said the government will be setting up a new interministerial group to coordinate the work across government and seeking to reinvigorate our engagement with disability stakeholders to help shape our plans. So will the Minister confirm what this engagement will involve, including which DDPOs will be engaged, as repeatedly recommended by the UN? And will she publish details of the membership in terms of reference for this group? And will that extend to the Department of Health and Social Care, there are real concerns that the consultation of the Green Paper on adult social care, which includes support for disabled people, is failing to engage with DDPOs. And the response to my question in the social care debate on the 25th of April just shows complete lack of understanding about Article 19 of the Convention and what it means, what is meant by independent living. The UN Committee brought out a general comment on Article 19 last year in which they referred to how institutionalisation can occur in people's own homes, and people are becoming isolated, separated from society, if they are not given that basic support. We're effectively seeing, as I say, re-institutionalisation of disabled people due to the current cut in social care. Waiting until the autumn, as it has been said, until we see the adult social care Green Paper is just not good enough. We've seen £7 billion in cuts to social care, 1.2 million people, including disabled people, not getting the support they need. The government's failure to recognise and act on this social care crisis is affecting our most vulnerable citizens, and it is to their shame. Finally, will the government look at producing a cumulative impact assessment of all policies and their impact on disabled people since 2010, as recommended by so many organisations? It is time, Dame Cheryl, for a different approach, which is summarised in the manifesto which we developed with and for disabled people. Nothing about you without you. I know my honourable friends are building on these commitments, which include scrapping current disability assessments, replacing them with a holistic, person-centred approach based on principles of dignity and inclusion. We've already committed to incorporate the UNCRPD fully into UK law, something that was rejected by this government. We believe that, like the NHS, our social care system is there, our social security system is there for every one of us. 9 out of 10 people become disabled. It is an acquired disability, and we should recognise it can happen to anyone, and we need to ensure that we have that support. It's time that things change, and I hope the Minister can reassure us that that is going to happen. Thank you, Dave Sharrow.
Yes. I would like to start the wind-ups at around 10:30, so if the two speakers that are on their feet can bear that in mind, I'd be absolutely delighted. Mike Hill.
Thank you, Dame Cheryl. And it's a pleasure to speak under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the Right Honourable Member for Canterbury on her excellent speech. I wish to focus really on the effective universal credit on disabled people and others. As we all know by now, the National Audit Office has released a report ahead of the rollout of universal credit, stating that the new benefits cost more to administer than the previous system of all 6 benefits it's replaced, which includes job seekers allowance, tax credit, housing benefit, PIP and ESA. The spending watchdog also said it was uncertain if universal credit would ever deliver value for money. The report proves that the Department of Work and Pensions' assertion that everything is going well is false, as many of my constituents in Hartlepool can testify to. Hartlepool was one of the early implementers of universal credit. My office receives issues with universal credit on a daily basis, and many people in the town have become accustomed to this unjust and arbitrary system. Some of them have not just experienced hardship, they have suffered near destitution through delayed payments, sanctions, where all benefits are affected, not just one, and drop in the level of benefit received compared to income derived from previous benefits. Dame Cheryl, honourary members will also be aware of the recent High Court judgment regarding the rollout of the new payment system. 2 severely disabled men, one of whom is a constituent of mine, experienced unlawful discrimination when their benefits were significantly reduced after moving from one area to another and subsequently onto universal credit. In the case of my constituent, who can only be identified by the initials AR and who is 36 years old, he moved from Middlesbrough to Hartlepool in 2017. AR has severe mental health problems and was forced to move because he could no longer afford the property he was living in due to the bedroom tax. Unfortunately for him, he moved to an area where universal credit was already being rolled out and was therefore required to make a claim under the new scheme. Both my constituent and the other complainant were advised by the DWP staff that their benefit entitlement would not change. However, they experienced a monthly drop of £178 under universal credit. Following the judgment, their solicitor Tessa Gregory from Lee Day said, "Nothing about either of the claimants' disability or care needs changed. They were simply unfortunate enough to need to move local authorities into a universal credit full service area. The government needs to halt the rollout and completely overhaul the system to meet people's needs, not condemn them to destitution. If this doesn't happen, further legal challenges will inevitably follow. Universal credit has taken significantly longer to roll out than intended, may cost more, as the NAO has determined, and that the benefits system it replaces and the DWP will never be able to measure properly whether it has achieved its stated goal of increasing employment. On the contrary, thanks in part to the fact that universal credit includes a broader span of claimants, such as disabled, required to look for work than, say, job seekers allowance, the number count of those unemployed in full service areas has been inflated. And because of this, Hartlepool, my constituency, currently holds an unenviable record of having the highest rate of unemployment in the country. The total number of unemployed claimants in my constituency in May 2018 was 4,080. That's 9.6% of the economically active population of the town, compared to the rest of the UK average of 2.8%. Dame Cheryl, when universal credit is rolled out across other constituencies, I am confident that we will lose that unwanted title, particularly as I'm proud to say our figures for youth unemployment are amongst the best in the UK. Dame Cheryl, the NAO office report concludes that the DWP has not shown significant sensitivity towards some claimants, and it does not know how many claimants are having problems with the programme or if they have suffered hardship, as is the case of AR. In 2017, around 1/4 of new claims were not paid in full or on time. Late payments were delayed on average by 4 weeks between January and October of that year. 40% of those affected waited in total around 11 weeks or more, and 20% waited around 5 months. Never mind the able-bodied, just imagine the effect this has had on disabled people. Dame Cheryl, they are talking about my constituents, about a system that renders people homeless, destitute and desperate. It is simply unacceptable, chaotic and catastrophic, and I pity those in other areas who are about to feel its full force.
Cheryl, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and can I congratulate my honourable friend for Canterbury on securing such an important debate. And I think my honourable friend for Oldham East and Saddleworth really hit the nail on the head with what a condemnation of this government this report is. And I want to emphasise, because it can't be emphasised enough, just how damning the 2016 UN report is. Because members opposite can talk all they want with weasel words about the system getting better and all this, but we know that's not the case. And it's certainly not the case in a constituency like mine in North Liverpool, one of the most deprived in the country, where, and I want to tell the member for Henley, we've had our 2 job centres closed, and the council has worked so hard and tirelessly to develop co-location plans, to put any proposal in front of the government to save those job centres, to absolutely no avail. So I wish him better in Henley, but it certainly hasn't worked in North Liverpool. And the chairwoman of the UN's Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities described the government's treatment of the sick as disabled as a human catastrophe. And that's not poetry, it's not a rhetorical flush. They use this language deliberately and precisely, based on the weight of evidence behind this report. And it came to the conclusion that this government's welfare cuts have resulted in grave and systematic violations of the human rights of disabled people. And it is a national scandal, and it's one that I see in my surgeries every single week. And I'm going to talk about a few cases that I've had to deal with in recent months. And it should be a wake-up call to this government. But instead, the government learns no lessons. In my constituency, my caseload is loaded with complaints relating to personal independence payments. Instead of supporting people, the process is dehumanising, inaccurate, and worsens and exacerbates the health conditions that my constituents are suffering from. And it's no surprise that there's widespread distrust of the assessment. when 68% of PIP decisions are taken to tribunals. And as I said earlier, in Liverpool that means a 9-month wait to get the right decision and often the decision overturned. And in that time, people lose their mobility vehicles. And what cost to government when they have to return those mobility vehicles? And what I've seen, and I wonder whether it is systematic of the system, is people going from a low rate of care and a high mobility to a high rate of care to a low mobility. And this seems to happen in case after case. Because if your care rate goes up, you get a couple of quid extra a week. But if you lose your mobility, your higher rate mobility, you lose your car, you lose your ability to leave the house, and you lose your ability to exist. At a recent Prime Minister's questions, I challenged the Prime Minister on a specific case of Anthony, and he has a chronic debilitating illness, and after his PIP assessment had this 9-month wait. And once this was raised in Parliament, the DWP was able to intervene and overturn the decision. But I see this every single week. The Prime Minister is asked about it every single week. And it's always an individual case. Well, it's not an individual case. It's built into the system. And I'd like to know what work the Minister is doing with the Department for Justice about these tribunal waits. Is that something that she is working on? Because you must invest in the court systems if this problem is going to be resolved. And I just don't see any work taking place on it whatsoever. The government's contractors, Atos, Capita and Maximus, have consistently failed to meet basic performance standards. One of my constituents was asked by an assessor about her cerebral palsy, a lifelong condition from birth, how long she'd had it, and if it's going to get better. I mean, what on earth is going on? And what is the government doing when these cases are brought to light? Several others have told me that the information in their assessment report was inaccurate and didn't reflect what was said in the assessment. But for some of my constituents, even getting that far is a challenge. And my office is inundated with reports of the unsuitability of assessment centres for disabled people. Problems ranging from a lack of suitable parking, no drop curb for wheelchairs, no disabled access button to open doors. A report released this month by Muscular Dystrophy UK found that 2 in 5 respondents hadn't been sent to an assessment centre that wasn't accessible for disabled people. You couldn't make this stuff up. And it's not one-by-one individual cases. This is a systemic problem at the heart of the government's policy. And until they wake up to that fact, nothing is going to improve. The pointless reassessments of people with severe long-term or progressive conditions is cruel and an absurd waste of resources. I have a constituent with Down syndrome whose payments stopped after she was transferred to PIP, as did another constituent with MS. While I welcome the announcement this week that the government is preparing to end such unnecessary reviews of people with severe or progressive conditions, it shouldn't have taken the determined effort of disability campaigners, which the government needs to understand. They are debilitating these people already. The fact that people have to be part of national and local campaigns just to get basic human dignity in the assessment process is absolutely outrageous. In any case, it is simply not enough to tinker around the edges. The truth is that all these problems are not glitches in the system, they are the system itself. Research published this month by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation found that almost 650,000 people with physical or mental health problems were destitute in the UK last year. That means being so poor they can't afford essentials such as heating, regular meals or basic toiletries. The systematic impoverishment and denial of basic rights highlighted in this report and others are part of what we now know is a hostile environment, not just in 1 or 2 government departments, but across the board. And if society is judged by how it treats its most vulnerable, then what does that say about ours? And I want to finish on this. It is simply absurd to think we can treat disabled people, we can treat the vulnerable or the dispossessed with anything other than dignity. Or we must treat them with dignity. But it's simply absurd to think you can when you have a programme of austerity, of cuts on local authorities, on cuts across the board. And I'm afraid that is what this report is signalling. This government's austerity agenda not only does it harm our communities, our society, but it hits the most vulnerable and the poorest hardest.
The wind-ups, Dr. Lisa Cameron.
Thanks, Dame Cheryl. It's an absolute pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, particularly given all of the excellent work that you've done over the years for people with autism and on the all-party group. And I'd particularly like to thank the Honourable Lady from Canterbury, who I thought made an excellent, detailed and thorough speech. It was very clear the empathy that she feels for her constituents and the hard work that she is going to be taking forward in the constituency on their behalf, and to particularly thank her for bringing this important debate to be heard today. I'd also like to thank the honourable members who contributed by reminding us that some progress is being made, particularly in employment and with the Disability Confidence Scheme, and that further employers are signing up to the scheme. I think it is important that we do make progress with that scheme, but I would caution that I'm aware an employer can sign up to the scheme without actually, and reach the full level, I believe, without actually employing anyone with a disability. So further progress, I would suggest, requires to be made in that regard. And I'd like to thank all of the other honourable members who contributed for really outlining the widespread failings that we have in the system, giving their constituency case examples to show the impact on persons that they're trying to help, and trying to highlight where the issues lie, not to berate the government entirely, but to suggest areas where we need to work collectively to take things forward, because we must work collectively in order to improve the lives of people with disability across the United Kingdom, and also to ensure that they reach their full potential. We're aware of the reason we're here, and the optional protocol allowed the UN committee to investigate a state party if they received reliable evidence of grave and systematic violations of the Convention. And the UK is the first country to be investigated by the UN in relation to this Convention, which I believe brings great shame, but it also is a warning, and it's a call to improve where we are, and I think that that is something that we must grasp and we must take forward very stridently. The report published on the 6th of October 2016 found that reforms have led to grave and systematic violations of the rights of persons with disabilities, emphasising in particular changes to housing benefit entitlement, eligibility for PIP and social care, and the ending of the Independent Living Fund. I'm aware that government has challenged the veracity of the report, but it must be said that it was based upon thorough research, visits across the United Kingdom, all 4 nations of the United Kingdom, interviews with over 200 people, collection of more than 3,000 pieces of documentary evidence. Where facts were disputed, these were cross-checked with collateral sources, including national statistics and also parliamentary inquiry reports. So I think that whilst honourable members wish to challenge the report, it's a thorough and detailed report. And whilst one in terms of the impact assessment, the cumulative impact assessment on disabled people has not been conducted by government to challenge the report, we have to take that report, we have to take its findings, and we have to view it very seriously and make sure that the system is overhauled in a positive way that changes the lives of people with disability. I wish to touch briefly on welfare benefits, but that's been covered very thoroughly today, so I'll just touch briefly on it. The Access to Work Fund, I feel it is a good scheme, but I think it requires much further publication in terms of awareness, because many people, particularly in my constituency and beyond that I've spoken to through the All-Party Parliamentary Group of Disability, have not been aware of it. And I think where something has the potential to assist people, we should really be ensuring that they can access that scheme. Yes.
The point there about access to work is absolutely right. And I think of the 4 million disabled people who want and are able to work, 25,000 have had support through access to work on a yearly basis, it just isn't adequate enough.
Dr. Lisa Cameron.
So perhaps where things are assisting, we need to be looking at rolling those out and generalising them to make sure that those who need that system can access it. It is an irony indeed that people can't access to work. I want to just speak briefly on the need for medical collateral information to be accepted and actually routinely sought in terms of welfare assessments, because often I feel that these assessments are conducted in a way which perhaps doesn't lend to getting the adequate information, and people maybe aren't aware that they can bring that information, or they don't understand the system properly. But that is so crucial, because often people who come to be assessed are anxious and stressed. They maybe are not able to explain in the best way the extent of their difficulties, but having that collateral information can just be so valuable in making sure that an accurate assessment is undertaken in the first place, and the individual doesn't have to go through the stress of appeals processes, which really has such a devastating impact. The Scottish Government are intending to place dignity and respect at the heart of the welfare system, and I feel that that's obviously in transition currently, but that's a great aspiration, and I think that that's something we should be aspiring to across the 4 nations. I would ask the Minister to look at ahead of the ARC inquiry that the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Disability completed last year. It points out a number of areas that are so important, including access to training in job sectors, particularly those which are going to be sectors of the future, where jobs are likely to be found. The government has made some movements on apprenticeships, and I'm grateful for that, and I think that much more can be done. Public procurement to reward businesses who provide inclusive employment opportunities, to ensure that it's not just about cost that procurement contracts are awarded on, but also it looks at equality legislation and inclusion wherever possible. And I think also we need to be very mindful that when we think of people with disabilities, often the stereotype is that they are unemployed or work for someone else, but we really need to also think about maximising skills and potential and looking at further opportunities for entrepreneurs who have disabilities, because actually that could offer a very flexible work pattern which may suit many people, but it also would harness the skills and abilities of so many people who perhaps are not already in the workplace and wish to take forward and employ other people and contribute greatly to our economy. So let's try to change the rhetoric on that. With the minutes I have left, I would have a plea to the Minister that motability, people are losing their motability cards. Is there any opportunity that during appeal process that people could maintain or retain their cards during that process rather than losing them? Because I've recently had a constituent who won their appeal but had already taken out a loan for a car and then had a motability car and a massive loan at the end of it, and surely that's not something that should be happening when the process was faulty in the first place. I think I have like half a minute left, Karen.
Thank you so much. But just to say, with the announcement, and a very welcome announcement of the Joe Cox Loneliness Fund with the Minister, £20 million, it's really welcome. But isn't it counterintuitive that the government, on the one hand, are offering this sort of money to combat loneliness, and on the other hand, taking away mobility cars?
Yes, we must ensure inclusion and that people can be independent and live as independently as possible. And the final point that I want to make before sitting down is just that the closure of banks right across the United Kingdom means that many people feel very vulnerable going to mobile banks. Actually, when I spoke to RBS, they told me that they don't even have ramps for their vans, so these mobile vans are not accessible. Is this something that the Minister could have a dialogue with RBS in particular and other banks in relation to people with disabilities? have told me that they feel vulnerable in an open setting, getting money from a mobile van when they can access it, and they're fearful that it may place them at risk. These are some of the issues, the practical issues we really need to take forward to improve people's lives. Thank you.
Marsha de Cordova.
Thank you, Dame Cheryl. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I firstly begin by congratulating my honourable friend from Canterbury, firstly for securing this important debate, but for her incredibly powerful speech that she gave. And she was absolutely right to highlight that no government should be introducing legislation that discriminates against disabled people, rightly stating that this government's record is a national shame and highlighting the dire inequalities, whether it's social security, whether it's access to justice and the increase in poverty, the access to information. We all know there are huge difficulties with access to digital information that my honourable friend from Batley and Spen also highlighted, but also the lack of alternative formats for those living with sight loss. And she was right to also call out the lack of legislation that covers the intersectional discrimination. I also want to pay tribute to some of my other colleagues, my honourable friends from Hartlepool, Liverpool, Walton, and the powerful speech from my colleague and my honourable friend, the member for Oldham East and Saddleworth, who has led the way and held this government to account for many years, powerfully holding them to account. And I thank her for all the work that she has done and all the work that she will continue to do. She rightly highlights that this government has chosen not to include the Charter for Fundamental Rights within the EU withdrawal bill, which is a shame. My honourable friend from Peterborough sharing those powerful testimonies from some of her constituents, and I just want to thank everybody for all their efforts. But everyone, it is right to point out that this is a shame and there is no other way of looking at. The UK were once at the forefront of disability rights, passing the groundbreaking legislation 48 years ago for the chronically ill and disabled persons, and that was led by Lord Alf Morris, who shortly afterwards became the first Minister for Disabled People, and I am honoured to also be that person today. But this was a response to disability campaigners who were calling for attention to the deep and pervasive injustices that were faced by disabled people. We became signatories to the convention in 2007, December 2007, committing us to progressively realising the rights of disabled people, our rights to live independently, to be included in the community, to education, to access justice. But after 8 years of Tory brutal cuts to disabled people's social security, 8 years of increasingly cruel and degrading assessments and sanctions, and 8 years of being stigmatised by government ministers, disabled people know that this government has not been defending their rights, and that is why the UNCRPD committee found disabled people's rights had been gravely and systematically violated. The significance of this judgment is difficult to overstate. The UK wasn't merely the first country to be found in breach of the Convention's obligations. We were the first country to ever be investigated. So rather than progressive implementation of disabled people's rights over the last 8 years, we have been instead witnessing an unprecedented erosion and violation of our rights across government departments. The committee found that the government were grossly failing disabled people. Article 19, the right to live independently and in the community. Article 28, the right to an adequate standard of living. And there has been a mockery by the brutal cuts to disabled people's social security. The 2012 Welfare Reform Act alone cut £28 billion in people's social security, with half of those in poverty, now either disabled or living with someone who is disabled. Almost a quarter of disabled people are now forced to miss meals because of economic hardship, and 1 in 5 cannot pay to heat their homes. It is these drastic cuts to social security that led the UN committee to find that disabled people were the single biggest group affected by Tory austerity policies. And when the UN detailed its systematic impoverishment of disabled people, an entirely predictable effect of the government's austerity policies, and which one, of course, predicted by disability groups but ignored by the government, that has refused to continue to carry out a full cumulative impact assessment of these cuts. As the I will very, very briefly.
Very briefly, can I just ask, would she agree with me that one of the most disappointing and outrageous points of this government is that it has actually wasted over £100 million on pointless appeals and putting disabled people through a nightmare trying to access the benefits they rightly deserve?
Absolutely. My honourable friend makes an absolutely right point. So I want to just ask the Minister, will the government now commit to carrying out a cumulative impact assessment on their tax and social security reforms since 2010? In addition to the devastating cuts and suspicion of disabled people have been endlessly mistreated by the chaotic Department for Work and Pensions. And it has repeatedly been found by High Court judgments that they have blatantly discriminated against disabled people. Only last week, where the cutting of disability premiums from Universal Credit were found to be unlawfully discriminatory. The further blatant discrimination against PIP claimants and the continued underpayments of employment and support allowance. It is not just social security failures that the UN had found to be undermining disabled people. The report also found the lack of social care funding for disabled people. Since 2009, there has been nearly a 30% fall in the number of disabled people receiving social care support. And as the UN report has also recognised that social care is vital for many disabled people to live independently. So can the Minister outline again today whether or not the government's forthcoming Green Paper will actually include working-age adults? I asked the Secretary of State for Health this question on Monday, but I didn't get a full answer. On the right to work, the government has not done enough to remove those barriers faced by disabled people. There is a lack of high-quality impairment-specific support. Their flagship disability confidence scheme does not measure the number of disabled people moving into work as a direct result of the scheme. Access to work needs to be improved, extended and better publicised, and we need to remove the discriminatory cap. So I will ask the Minister again, will she consider removing that cap? And finally, signatories to the CRPD are obliged to promote inclusive education, but under the government, we again see a regression with the rise in special school places. Again, I urge the Minister to ask her, what is she doing to encourage her colleagues to ensure that we improve inclusive education? In recent months, the government has created this cross-ministerial body that will supposedly promote disability issues across government, as at the same time as cutting the number of staff at the Office for Disability Issues. My honourable friend for Aldermees and Sadarwell has already asked, what is the scope of this group? Where is the published terms of reference? The government is helping to organise a global summit in July, but why should any other state take the UK government seriously on disability rights when it is in itself has systematically violating the rights of disabled people and continues to ignore the UN's recommendations? When will we be seeing the government's response to the UN's report? I just want to finally say it is a Labour government that, when we do get into power, that will introduce and incorporate the Convention into UK law. It is a Labour government that will scrap the punitive sanctions regime. It will be a Labour government that will also get rid of the assessment regime and replace it with a more holistic and supportive assessment framework. It is no shame from us, but it is a shame on the government that we are having to stand here today and having to debate this issue once again. The government must now take heed and the government must now listen.
Yeah. Minister.
Thank you very much, Dame Cheryl. And like everyone else, I feel it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship as somebody who's taken a lifelong interest in disabled people and have made such a personal difference in bringing the first particular piece of legislation which supports people with autism. I also want to congratulate the member from Canterbury on this, her first Westminster Hall debate, and from the way in which she's approached this, I'm sure it's not going to be the last. And after the government does publish its response to the UN inquiry, I'll be more than happy to come back to this chamber and debate it with her then. But just before I start making my responses to the individual points that were raised, like everyone else in this chamber, I want to ensure that every disabled person or person with a health condition in our country has the opportunity to play their full part in society. Now, that includes where they can, at work, and of course there are disabled people who can't work, and they must be supported. But I utterly refute the allegations that have been made today that we are discriminating against disabled people, that we are systematically undermining and violating their human rights, or worst of all, that we are targeting them when it comes to welfare support. I have so little time and I've been asked so many questions that I won't take an intervention. We are utterly committed to the Convention. You know, it was Britain that helped develop and shape this Convention. We were one of the first countries in the world to sign it and to ratify it in 2009. And we're one of the very, very few nations that have also ratified the Convention's optional protocol, which allows for individual complaints to be raised and permits the UN Committee to investigate those particular violations or allegations of violations of the Convention. And that is what happened. And this is the first time that it has happened, and we were very disappointed when the representatives of the UN came to the UK, that they simply did not take on board the evidence that the government gave them. They did not acknowledge the full range of support. And when we set out our response, and I will be setting that response out in full, we'll be very clearly making the case and rebutting the allegations that have been levelled against us. We firmly believe that a disability or health condition should not dictate the path a person is able to take in life, including in society or the workplace. And this is at the basis of everything that we're doing to try to make sure that disabled people are able to realise their potential, including at work. As I said, we're very engaged with the United Nations. We've had constructive meetings. We are constructively engaging with them. And of course, I will be meeting all in full the reporting requirements. Now, in line with the conventions, as members will know, disability is mainstreamed. It's mainstreamed across government. And I want to reassure everyone that we have very strong legislation on our statute book to protect disabled people. That's through the Public Sector Equality Duty in the Equality Act 2010 and in the Northern Ireland Act 1998. These are very strong protections, some of the strongest protections in the world. Now, I was asked by the member for Oldham East and Southwark, why we've not performed a cumulative impact assessment about welfare reform. Well, we do undertake a cumulative assessment of reforms each fiscal event. And this is because we want to be as transparent as possible regarding the cumulative distributional impacts of government policy, including welfare reforms, tax changes, direct and indirect, and public spending changes. And to present as full a picture as possible, HMT has a project, they project forward living costs and food survey, which includes all the information that members have mentioned today. And this information enables me to say today very clearly that the proportion of people in a family where someone is disabled in relative poverty has not risen since 2010. These allegations that we are driving people to the food banks and forcing people into destitution is simply an irresponsible statement. And the proportion of people in a family where someone is disabled who are in absolute poverty is at a record low. And that's because we're spending over 50 billion a year on benefits to support disabled people and people with health conditions. Now that's up by 7 billion since 2010, and it's around 2.5% of GDP, over 6% of the government spending. Now, as a share of our GDP, our public spending on disability and incapacity is the second highest in the G7. Only Germany spends more. And disability spending will be higher every year, right the way through the spending review. Every year higher than 2010. There is no freeze on the benefits that people with disabilities have received, and they are not subject to the cap. So it is really important in these debates that we have the facts. Of course there's more we can do. Of course I want to close the disability unemployment gap. Of course there's always more we can be doing. But let's actually deal with the facts of the situation and stop this really quite irresponsible talk that we hear in the chamber today, and we hear it in the main chamber. Because, you know, who's going to suffer? Who's going to suffer from what we've been hearing from the opposition today? It is going to be disabled people and their families who are going to be frightened to come forward and get the benefits that are there for them, frightened to come forward and get the support that's available to them. Now, in the few remaining moments, I want to touch on some of the criticisms that we've heard about PIP and ESA. Now, PIP and ESA has been subject to a number of independent reviews. Most recently, we had an independent review of PIP undertaken by Paul Gray, and he published his findings last year, and I published my response. And I responded positively to each and every one of those recommendations. We are moving forward with continuous improvement to PIP. The DWP Select Committee did a very full inquiry into the assessment process, and they have welcomed my response. They have welcomed the series of measures that we're taking, in particular the video recording of the assessments. It's really important to me that we build confidence and trust in that assessment process. We know from independent data for the vast majority of people undertaking a work capability assessment or a PIP assessment, they feel treated with respect and dignity, and it works. But one person receiving poor treatment or not getting the right result is one too many, and that's why we're so determined to implement all the reforms. Now, those reforms stretch from working more closely with medical professionals, that point was raised several times today, making sure it's easier for medical professionals to be able to provide data to the process, making sure that companions can support people in those assessments, making sure that home visits are implemented wherever that is going to support people, making sure that all the forms are in an accessible format. Each of and every suggestion that's been put to me, we actively consider and am implementing. I have a huge amount of stakeholder involvement with disabled people, with people representing disabled people through our PIP forum, and a whole range of bodies that we have with the DWP. People are co-designing these benefit systems with us. When PIP itself was introduced, it was developed with organisations supporting disabled people and disabled people themselves. And we want to keep on making sure. You know, PIP is a modern, dynamic benefit. You know, the government treats people who have mental health conditions as seriously and equally as people with physical health conditions. So many more people are being supported and helped on PIP than they ever did on the DLA legacy benefit. And as we know, the evidence will show more people are receiving higher rates of support on PIP than DLA. 30% of people move on PIP get the highest levels when it was only 15% on DLA. So it is really important that people who are listening to these debates, who follow these debates, who have disabilities, or their families have members who are disabled, that they know that there is support for them, and they should come forward, and they should come confidently forward to receive that support in the full knowledge that where we come across problems, we are working tirelessly to improve the system. Now, there was also some talk about issues around access to work. And of course, access to work, we are very, very keen to see that grow and develop. We've recently made an announcement so that the support that's available to each person each year is double average income. So that's just under £60,000 per person per year to support an individual into work. It's a demand-led scheme. I'm very pleased to see that we see last year an 8% growth. And this is one budget we're very happy to see grow, because that means more people are getting into work and more people are being supported into work. And I very much have listened and welcomed the comments about Disability Confident. Disability Confident is a growing and very successful scheme, and I'm grateful to the honourable members here who've signed up, and I hope more will come next week to the launch of the Community Challenge, where I'm asking leaders in communities, that's us, MPs in our local communities, to spend time in our summer recess dedicating ourselves to visiting businesses and employers, asking them to become disability confident, asking them to provide opportunities for more disabled people in their communities. And I hope as many people here as possible will come along to that event and will join in those activities. There have been so many questions asked today that I haven't been able to answer, but I will write back in detail to every point that has been raised today so that we can all work together to make sure every disabled person in our country is truly supported to be the best they can be and play as full a part as possible.
Rosie Duffield to wind up.
Thank you, Dame Cheryl. And I'd really like to thank everybody for making my first Westminster Hall debate so fantastic, because the contributions from across the House were really special today, and the passionate speeches that we heard from the member from Oldham East and Saddleworth, particularly, and Peterborough, were really moving today. And that's about it, because I know that we're out of time. So thank you very much for your chairmanship and your generosity this morning.
The question is that this House has considered the Government's response to the UN report on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Order, order. We now come to the next